Welcome back. This is our third video in the series on revising your work in stages. We are now in stage 2. So stage 2 is to communicate your purpose. And your goal is to make your point clear throughout the paper. And if you went through the first video, you probably got a really good taste of how you kind of do that as you're going through. And now we're kind of finalizing it. We're really gonna dig in deep and hammer in those final points. Now is the time we're going to revise that introduction. I want you guys to always remember that the point of the introduction is to grab the reader's attention and kind of draw them into the story you're going to tell them, the discussion you're having, the argument you want to make. And that's why it's important. Like we ended with the last slide, you have to kind of have an idea of who your audience is. In the case of the Dairy Queen drama that we have been going through, the audience is someone looking to be entertained and maybe to learn a lesson about growing up, right? But most of the time when people read memoirs, they just want to be entertained. At minimum, for your introduction, you're going to include a hook or an attention getter, the topic and why it matters. You could potentially mention scholars if you're doing an academic essay that have talked about your topic or even an aspect of your topic, but maybe they didn't cover a part of it that you think is really important. That's often very good to have in an introduction. Any vital background information, things people need to know before they can move on. Think about what they need to know and in what order. And then also you're going to definitely want to include the thesis of the main point. And I would say leave that in bold while you're editing. At this point, I also want to start to encourage you to think about the reader's experience as they're going through your paper. Think about it a little bit. If someone doesn't know anything about it, how can you best convey the information to them? So looking at our draft, we have 6 points essentially that are being made, and we're going to take a quick look at the introduction. So first of all, the title, we've already been revising that. The student originally had Dairy Queen drama, and it's great, but then I've added a subtitle because that's what I would have done. I can't live without a subtitle. And I think that My Summer in the Freezer works really well with the owner's cheap, right? And this is just sort of a general observation, and I think it's pretty accurate. When we move down to our opening line, the opening line is traditionally where you expect to see the hook. This really lets us down. I would like to talk about my first job at Dairy Queen. So this is a simple declarative statement of intent, and it's not that interesting. It tells us that the topic is the first job and where it takes place at Dairy Queen, but it doesn't really ignite my imagination and curiosity. And generally speaking, you don't want to have declarative statements like this. Like this paper is going to discuss, or I'm going to talk about, anything like that. I would just say start off by just deleting it because you don't need that. Any place really where you are using I, it depends on the genre. This is a first-person narrative memoir, so I is going to come up, but you do want to evaluate it. Do I need I here? And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. So often if I'm grading somebody's paper and they start off with, I'm going to talk about whatever, I will just cut out the first part of that sentence and change it to the topic, like whatever is important because it's even though that's clunky and laborious, it's still better than saying just blandly, I'm going to talk about this or that. Get to the point, right? That's always should be, when you're thinking about your reader's experience in your paper, think about the time, think about their attention span. Reading is work, and you want to hold their hand and guide them through. So that work is your work to do. And it starts at this stage, essentially, when you're preparing the paper to be submitted. Often I will have people replace this kind of thing with something really undescriptive, like, my first job at Dairy Queen had pros and cons, or had ups and downs, or something like that, which is it's not quite as bad, but it's not descriptive. So you really want to get right to the meat of what you're trying to talk about. And I think we'll go ahead and say, and use this, right? Because it's something that comes up over and over again, and it's not earth-shattering. It's not the world's greatest hook, but it's better than just saying, I'm going to write this paper that talks about this thing. It gives us something to think about. So this is the kind of descriptive sentence that I will often see as the opening sentence for a lot of papers, where it's not clear yet, but it's getting someplace, right? This is beginning to express something. And then we're just specifically looking at the introduction, right? This first part of this video. So when we've got our topic and why it matters, basically, we still really don't have a hook. The title's pretty good. And what I would suggest is if you've got a pretty good title and you don't have a hook, then try to use the title to make the hook. And if you are, like, let's say you have a good hook, like you found a real winner of a quote, try to think about what your paper is trying to express using that quote, and if you can use that in the title. Sometimes it's hard to come up with titles, so that's what I usually do, and it's worked pretty well for me. So this is a nice narrative opening for this particular story. And I'm just going to start amassing opening lines, and I advise you to do this just as a matter of course, because basically you're creating like a list of options and you'll choose the best one when you run out of time. That's how I treat an introduction. I'll have all kinds of clever things. Usually I'll have like 4 or 5 opening lines, and then eventually I'll combine a couple of them and cut the rest out. I decided to include this reference to the narrator's dad because he does come up a lot towards the end. So I think that it's good to kind of introduce your major players, for the narrator at least, early on, and just as much as possible to create that sense of unity. And that's the point of an introduction, is to kind of have like a unity with the rest of the paper. I can also, because this information has been moved up, I can delete this part. And then we have this idea that she's been looking for a job all over the city, but she finally got this evening shift at Dairy Queen, and then she wasn't picky about where she worked. She wanted to save up for a car. So sort of just playing around with the idea of like dad energy. I put, like many teenagers, when I was 16 I wanted a car, and when I mentioned this dream to my dad, he suddenly decided I needed the responsibility of a summer job. I think this is a little bit cute, because it kind of gives you a little bit of a characterization of the dad as being maybe a little bit crafty, maybe a little bit cheap, or he too is cheap, and he's like, oh no, she wants a car, you need a job. And I think that kind of comes across and is a little bit clever. I might, if I were revising this, I would take out like many teenagers, but I might not. I'll just leave it in for now. I'll give it the gray probation line, right? So I've got I wanted to save up for a car. I don't know that that's necessary now, because we know it's implied, brevity here. The car is part of the goal of this, and apparently the responsibility is going to be a side product. So we're really setting the tone with this first line. I do think we can move I was not picky about where I worked to the I had looked for a job all over the city. I think that makes good sense, right? Because they're not picky, they're looking everywhere. We can take out summer because it's already implied. We've already established that. We don't need to repeat ourselves. A thing I always will look for if I've got a pronoun hanging around is like, okay, who's this pronoun referring to? There's no referent for this pronoun, and it's actually unnecessary. And this is a case of the ubiquitous they, because we don't have any idea who they is. So I'm just going to change this. Actually, this is a good case for the passive voice. So I have edited that. I looked for a job all over the city and was finally hired to work evening shifts at the Dairy Queen in a strip mall near my house. And then we can just ignore this for now, because I moved a sentence that was here. That was the one that was at the beginning, remember, at first. So now it's way down here because we're talking about responsibility down here, and these two kind of go together, because if you look at this word and this word, they kind of work together. I mean, I know it was up there too, but that was about obtaining the job. So chronologically, this had to have the call to action first, and then the thing you're doing. So looking this over, I'm going to take out my first job at Dairy Queen, because it's not necessary. We've already established that that's a first job at Dairy Queen. We're going to take out taught me a lot about myself, because that's covered down here. And I'm going to include something about because I had never been responsible for so many things at once. I'm going to combine that sentence with the one after it, which is almost identical concept. And I'm going to explain, instead of just being vague and talking around it, I'm going to kind of do a quick overview of maybe as much of this as I can fit in without it becoming laborious. All right, so now I've added this sentence. I've taken this 10-cent raise and moved it up here. I've emphasized that it was measly, right? And that helps bring in this idea of the cheap owner. And this ties together the warning sign concept, because for a measly 10-cent per hour raise, I suddenly became responsible for the operation of a cheaply run franchise and its employees after dark in a rough neighborhood. I think that really gets to the heart of the issue that this narrator is having. I think it is redundant at this point to say that it was a lot of responsibility, so I'm taking that out. I'm going to change, because I like this extra trouble it caused me. I think that the writer's voice really comes through there. So I'm going to change this to despite all the extra trouble it caused me, and then I'm going to tie this together. The experience was worth it because it helped me discover my strengths as a good listener and made me think about my goals in life. I'm also going to take this off probation because I think it makes sense now. So I'm going to remove that, and I'm going to leave this introduction as is for now. I think it's just fine. It definitely gets all the major themes up and running. If you wanted to ever check, you could go through and color code your introduction to see if it's kind of reflecting the major themes of the paper. So I've done a little bit of the color coding here just to kind of get right at the point of what I'm trying to say. These are themes. There's still a couple themes that aren't reflected there. The whole narrator was a good listener. Essentially, we know that they are alluding to that there, right? They're alluding to like their strength. Oh, look at me. As a good listener. So there we have that. That's being covered. And then the last thing is that the owner's cheapness made the experience scary. Maybe alluded to here, arguably. But hopefully the process that I'm showing you is what's getting across here. We didn't end up getting this discussion, like the drama in the summer in the freezer. So those are things that may have to come up later. But I think that it's still working pretty well as like an introduction and title. So I hope that introduction to writing introductions was helpful, and our next video will be about topic sentences.